Hello, this is Loga Elder, and this is another installment of Let's Talk Consciousness, and this is a continuation of, I guess, what I'll call consciousness and conspiracies. Um, so I did a previous video running through a brief rundown of how I go from, being a kid, learning a little bit about Waco and Ruby Ridge, and then, the 93 attacks, Oklahoma, all these things that led up in the 90s to 9/11, and then that being kind of a watershed moment, not all overnight, but coming around to all these ideas over time, that the kind of cognitive dissonance of 9/11 triggered. So that being said, where I left off at the end of the last video was talking about how average people not acclimated to that idea will have a very hard time with those things. That only makes sense. So, where does that tie into consciousness, spirituality, any of those things? If the world is really this crazy, devious place where all sorts of sinister plans go down, and I've left most of the recent ones out, but yeah, as things come out, I mean, getting back to JFK, we have a big release of 3,000 some odd. I don't know what the number of documents was. I've read so many articles, and I now I don't remember. But anyway, as that's being sifted through, we're finding out basic things that I think were confirmed. The sort of truth movement or conspiracy theory community already knew, which is there was a second government, at least a second, probably more. But part of this release is knowing that JFK's, I believe it was his first medical examination, was noted that the wound in his neck was a front. You can see in the Zapruder film, he grabs his neck, starts pulling his tie and shit, or just grabbing his neck. But point being, you have official documents coming out now that confirm a conspiracy theory that people thought was nutty and fringe and wanted to dismiss, and now the proof is out there. And you have other parts of these releases, like information as far as the CIA investigating whether or not Hitler was still alive, and photograph and testimony that he was living in South America and so forth. Just all sorts of crazy shit that's coming out because you can't keep these things under wraps forever. Where does that leave average people? And so I think to anyone who's already on the kind of conspiracy theory side, if you're talking to anyone else about this who's not, by all means go slow. Start with whatever beginning you have, which is why in the first video I just kind of recapped a brief, path from there to here. But it's going to be difficult for a lot of people, and I think this sort of spiritual connection that I see, I don't always use the word spiritual. I mean, consciousness, you could use whatever word you like. It doesn't have to take, it's certainly not religious from my point of view. I don't really have much utility or use for religion, but I mean, as ancient texts go, sometimes there's some interesting things to be found there, but I'll put that aside. So I guess the concept of light and dark is probably the best way to look at it. If there's a meaning to life, if there's a purpose to life, and if it is this kind of consciousness manifestation, and that is to experience, to grow, to learn what you're made of, I think is my favorite way of putting it, is to, how else are you going to know what you're made of if you're not going through some difficult shit? And that's with this, rather strange idea that we may be, energetic patterns of consciousness that choose to become physical beings in order to, like I said, learn what we're made of by being in difficult situations. And if that's the case, it probably gets pretty dark. That the people who come from, maybe Buddhism or Hinduism, where there isn't really a big emphasis on the dark, it's kind of all about, improving yourself and your own karma and all that. And I mean, that's definitely something to focus on too. I think a lot of, like, I guess what you call New Age or consciousness kind of based spirituality, a lot of it doesn't focus on negativity, which is an approach. If you don't want to populate your mind with those thoughts, I think that's valid. But if you are kind of facing those things, you're bringing light in dark places, and you're going to have to look at them. And I think for some of these things, the only way they change is if you look at them. Particularly with some of the conspiracies about people being, taken and it's like I don't even want to say the words because I know YouTube is suppressing videos that talk about this, but I've probably already triggered that. So, whether it's human trafficking or organized rings of pedophilia, all sorts of really like the absolute darkest that you think human beings can get, just murdering people to get what you want. It's like the most sinister behavior that you can imagine, and that's just not now. That's throughout history. We've always had pockets of people doing really fucked up shit. Like, and if you think about it, just in this sense, how many Hitlers do you think there've been in history? Meaning, we've recorded history up to a point, but we've been anatomically modern humans for conservatively 150,000 years. I mean, some estimates are up to 250,000. Like people who if you could pull them out of the past and bring them to today, they would be completely similar. They would blend in completely. They're humans the way we are now, just as intelligent. So in that span of time, to think that there haven't been a lot of genocides and a lot of like dark eras and a lot of light eras, I assume. But that I think is just a thing that exists here that we have to deal with, and I think we have an incredible opportunity to face it, to bring light to it, and to bring it to an end. So I think that's why it's so important that average people have some awareness of these things, because they're going to have to. I think it's going to have to come out, as it does. It just comes out whether you want it to or not. Let's see where I'll go from there. All right, so speaking of light and dark in ancient texts, as I mentioned a moment ago, one good way to reference it, whether you're I'll put aside Christianity for the moment, that's kind of a different thing. But let's say you're kind of what I think a lot of people like me had an experience of being an atheist who moved a little bit towards Eastern philosophy and consciousness studies and some of the implications of, maybe higher levels of awareness and existence. If you are kind of going down that path, you might have crossed paths with the Bhagavad Gita, which is a ancient Hindu text that is one of many, but it's an interesting read, and it doesn't really invite you to become a Hindu. It's not like that, but it's an interesting read, and I think it kind of informs the world we're in today. I'll try to be brief, but basically the story as it begins is main character Arjuna is in the middle of what is basically like Game of Thrones. Like it's set in this time when a bunch of different groups are about to go to war over who is in charge. Massive like civil war, and Arjuna coincidentally, or happens to be friends with God. He's buddies with Krishna. Krishna not being the God in this context, but like a manifestation of God, one of many. But anyway, so he just happens to have God at his side and asks him to fly him over this big, what is going to be the battlefield. And he basically goes on to have a shit fit. I mean, Arjuna doesn't want to, as he puts it, fight his professors, his uncles, his cousins, like people that are his countrymen. He's going to fight with over this disagreement in power and this long backstory about who, all these different claims to the throne. And in that context, he just doesn't want to do it. He wants to just go move into the mountains and be a hermit. I mean, at least that's his little fit that he's throwing, that he just can't get his head around it. And the spiritual thing that arrives, the big interruption of the bigger picture that breaks him out of his little shit fit, that reminds him that he's not the center of the universe, is that Krishna transforms and like basically shows him a form of himself where he's like devouring all of them, like this massive swirling mass of like legs and faces and limbs. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, but basically he's saying, look, time is going to make corpses out of all these motherfuckers, and you can run from your purpose, or you can live it out and basically let go of your attachment of how you want things to go or what you think your needs are, and live out this drama because it's it's been set out for you, and it's an incredible experience. I mean, that's not really exactly, I'm kind of straying from that text now, but my take on that is, like, life is to be lived, and it's going to have challenges, and it's going to have dark places, and it's going to take you on some fucked up turns. And in the sense that we incarnate and we take on these challenges somewhat by choice and with foreknowledge from this larger pre-birth perspective that some people depict, that I think is a kind of right on track. Um, Somebody who is born into this awful situation is maybe trafficked as a child and is abused in the worst ways possible. It's not to say that they set out to have that experience, and because it sounds like it justifies it or it makes it okay from the person who's doing it. But from this higher soul perspective, all this terrible abuse can have spiritual purposes. Like, it can be about you learning what you're made of. I mean, I don't mean to over divulge, but like, as a person who was abused as a child, I don't look at that and shake my fist at God. I mean, I wasn't even really I'm not really a God person. It's a phrase that I don't find much use for, but sometimes. But my concept of it, I think, is more of a larger wholeness. But my point is, you know, as I got older and came to understand it, it's like it opened certain doors of perception for me about what I went through following that and how I processed it. And I don't lament the universe for laying that in my path. Like, I'm sure some do, and as that abuse, in terms of how bad it gets, can be unimaginable. I'm sure there's people who hearing that message is not very helpful because they're in the midst of their pain and it's an open wound. So I don't mean to try to diminish what they're going through, but I think it is something that, like, as dark as life gets, it is to be lived. And it's not, I mean, to renounce it, to give up on it, to hide from it, is to kind of put off the thing you came here to do, potentially. And in another sense, maybe create a necessity for it to happen to you again, in the next life, who knows, but that, there might be something you set to live out from this pre-birth perspective that is impossibly difficult to imagine, but it's something that you set out to do, and you thought you had the strength to do it from this larger perspective, and then once you're here, it's caused you to, cower and to get into victimhood and self-pity and not feel capable of living out your life with that damage. So, I mean, it's fucked up. It's it's hard to, it's also individual. It's hard to generalize, but that's my takeaway from it. Is some of these really difficult experiences, they put you in a place of learning how to transcend those things and let go. So in that sense, they can have incredible value. So back to conspiracies, I would say, as you learn about the darkest elements of our society, because I think this stuff is going to be coming out more and more. I mean, the stuff in Hollywood is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, people who abuse other adults is like priming everybody to understand that people like this, people in high institutions, have been abusing children. I mean, that's the material that is coming forth, and not many people are ready to hear it, but it's a thing that you get more and more of as this comes out. And I think as you're ready to go where the evidence takes you, it's a pretty dark place. So keep your spirits up. Don't let it get you down. Understand that as these things are exposed, it brings light to dark places, and it brings about change. And you also can bring about change in yourself, in the sense that you don't have to be at war with life. As dark as it gets, you don't have to be a victim to it, and you don't have to get caught up in its conflict. I mean, I know sometimes conflict is in front of you, but what I mean is your sense of doing the best you can and dealing with it is this prevailing thing that will get you through pretty much anything. I mean, I know that sounds crazy with some people's lives, that it's too hard to imagine, but um, not victimhood is the like lowest form of consciousness in some sense, and it's where you're the least capable of doing anything. So, by any means possible, you have to find it in yourself to know that you are capable of facing anything, and from the spiritual perspective that you're invincible, and that you set about to learn everything you possibly could about what it is to exist from every possible perspective. And this is just the present moment, and there are going to be others, and I don't know, I guess all I can say is enjoy your now as much as you possibly can, as dark as it gets and as light as it gets. Try to extract novelty from it, and enjoy how strange it all gets, and keep your head up.